I'm sharing. And I am going to pin myself and put myself up here. And maybe I will just mute everybody for now. You have the chat function still, of course. And you can unmute yourself if there is something important to cut in for. So we've been looking at what happened largely in the Mediterranean world for the last couple of weeks. We saw the West disintegrate. We saw Byzantium survive because of their concentration of population and wealth, as did Persia. So Slavic and Germanic invasions went up and around and bothered the West much more than it did either of the superpowers, but that they got involved in an aggressive take no prisoners war that went on for decades and really left themselves depleted. In fact, it opened the door for what we're going to talk about today, which is Muhammad and the rise of Islam. But before I get to that, I want to point out that the next two lectures after this one are going back and looking at conditions in the West, the Carolingian Empire, the development of feudalism, what this meant for the social organization in the West, now cut off from the Mediterranean. And then in the last session, we're going to focus again on Byzantium and the Arab world, Baghdad and Cordoba. We're going to look at the golden ages and the high periods for art and intellectual development in those parts of the world, and then end on a note in which we're looking at the state of the entire Western world at the end of the 11th century. In 1050 to 1100, which is where we will begin the next set of lectures, the High Middle Ages, at that point in time. That said, let's start looking at, in fact, I just have to come up here and make sure I have my little pointer, if I can find it. Annotate, here we go. I've got to remember where everything is all the time. And spotlights. Okay, we have our little pointer. Okay, so here we are. Byzantium and Persia are two highly centralized imperial empires. Byzantium to the west, state of the world, 600 AD, Common Era. The Sassanid Empire in the east. Byzantine society was organized around their urban elites, their internal bureaucracy, and a central army. Whereas Persian society was organized around a warrior landed aristocracy, almost feudal in character. So slightly different social organizations, but both strong centralized empires. The religion in both cases was both transcendental and monotheistic. Transcendental meaning it addresses issues of life everlasting. In the West and in Byzantium, it's Christianity and its various sectarian expressions, along with a tolerated, if only barely tolerated, Judaism, and a leftover classical paganism in places, usually among well-off aristocrats, which had itself evolved into a monotheistic view of the world, where there was a great God. They didn't believe, it wasn't so much the animistic god of the spring and Jupiter this and Hera that. It was largely had evolved into almost a deistic abstraction that believed that there was a great God, despite the fact that there were all this myriad of pagan cults to various expressions of that God. But it was monotheistic, as obviously was Christianity and as obviously was Judaism. In Persia, Zoroastrian religion was, for the most part, what we would think of as monotheistic. I don't want to get into the details of it. But it had no orthodoxy. It wasn't that there was a strong religious ideological set of underpinnings or theology underpinning it. There was very high tolerance as a result for other religious communities. So you had all over, under Persian control, Nestorian Christianity. Remember the Christian sect that had developed in Syria largely, and feeling the yoke of Justinian's authoritarianism and drive towards orthodoxy, felt that moving eastwards into Persian suzerainty was not a bad idea. There was also a lot of Judaism that had been there ever since the Babylonian captivity and had developed sects of its own, the so-called Rabbinites and Karaites and Samaritans and mixtures of the two of them. Largely, the Rabbinites and Karaites, if I were to oversimplify, largely believed in the Torah tradition, but never accepted any of the books, the prophetic books beyond Torah. They sort of froze in place at a certain point historically. And the economies of both, because they were established, what shall I say, hierarchical empires. At the bottom of such empires, you always have domestic agriculture as the foundation, mainly because it's urban and you have to support huge populations in the major cities. When you have cities like Byzantium itself, Constantinople, that are going to grow to a population of 400,000, and you have Damascus and places like that with hundreds of thousands of people, or at least high tens, you're going to need a agricultural base with a wheat belt or a corn belt that you can import from to support that intensity of population. It cannot be a Bedouin society. It can't be a nomadic society that's living off of herding. Arabia, on the other hand, was very tribal. It was clan-based. They were Bedouin populations. On the eve of Islam, they were polytheists, animists. Usually there were lots of little gods. In fact, places that became sacred to Islam, like the Kaaba in Mecca, was a holy place that was like a pantheon where several gods were being worshipped. They were pastoralists. They were goat herders. They were camel herders. They went along the importation routes coming from the Far East, the Spice Road and the like. So they were traders. They were on the move. They went from oasis to oasis. And since the 4th century, when rivalries between the Persian Empire and the Byzantine Empire created a kind of power vacuum in the middle, the DMZ, the no man's land in the middle, they were largely free of either empire's domination. So they got to develop a kind of a culture on their own. And on the map over here, Here, I can expand this for you a little bit. So basically, you're going to see that there are cities and some tribal centers. The Hejaz, this region, which we'll look at later on, which is right across from Ethiopia, is the population center of Arabia in this period, and usually any period because it's close to the Red Sea. But in the northern area, the Ghassanids in the northwest and the Lakhmids they're Arabic, they're Arabian, but these tribes tend to be Christian, the ones that lean towards and become clients of Byzantium. And the ones in the northeast, the Lakhmids, become clients of Persia. We will find, and I'll show you on a subsequent slide, that there are tribes, Bedouin tribes in this period that are Jewish. And we'll see what this means for the development of Islam in its early period. So Islam, when it rises, preserves many of the existing institutions of the region. They inherit, really, as we'll see, the superstructure of the Persian Empire, which they completely dominate in the ensuing period. So in effect, they're going to become an empire with a bureaucratic organization, as was Persia, and as is the Byzantine Empire. They will become a universalist religion, as is Christianity, and they will be organized around local parishes. They will not be centrally organized in the way that some religions try to do it. And culture and identity are going to be defined for them in religious terms, as we say. So here's the world in about 600. Arabia, as I was mentioning, and now you get a map that shows us some greater detail. Here's the Hejaz along the Red Sea. It's nomadic pastoralism and it's trade oriented. So the trade routes across the Hejaz had the Bedouin tribes guiding and taxing movements of caravans that would head up towards Syria or head up to the Persian capitals, depending. And remember, they could also use overland trade routes to bring goods from Ethiopia across the Red Sea, which was itself had both Jewish and Christian populations, across the Red Sea and then up the land routes. They were tribally organized. The Bedouin tribes had traditionally been atomic separate entities, but they were beginning to form into sort of super tribal associations. The most famous one for our purposes is the Quraysh, the tribe, a mercantile tribe. It's a tribe of tribes, if you will, of smaller tribes. And it controls Mecca. It's organized a confederation for the region. It's centered around the holy place, the sanctuary, the Haram, the center of which is the Kaaba. And Muhammad is born into the Quraysh, into the Hashemite sub-tribe or clan within it, and will follow his movement from the clan association outwards in subsequent slides. There are, and I've tried to show them a bit on the map. You will see them on a subsequent map more closely. There are pagan, Jewish, and Christian tribes. Contact with the Roman Empire, Rum, had been customary for centuries because of the trade routes through Syria, and Jews and Christians had reason to leave Rum. The languages of the region, Arabia was polyglot. Arabic was the main language, but had not been finalized into its, if you will, its the fullness of a literary expression that was a result of the Quran. But it did have lots of lyrical poetry, and it was influenced by other largely Semitic languages that had entered the region from the Mediterranean area, Aramaic and Syriac being the major two. Early Arabic writing is based on the Nabatean script that you can find at Petra, if any of you have ever visited that on a trip to Israel. Now you'll see in this map, there are indicators of pagan centers like Sana'a down in what would now be Yemen, Mecca itself. And then there are major Jewish presence around cities like Medina, which is going to be central to the story of Muhammad. And there are Christian centers that are going to play a major role, particularly Najran in the south. And you see how this whole region is controlled by the Quraysh. But there are these other tribal centers, always prefixed by Banu, which means the tribe of. Banu Kata, Banu Tamir, Banu Layan. What's the question? Love was made for me and you. Wait a second. I've got to, if you could mute yourself. There we go. Okay. Thanks. But moving along, Muhammad himself is born in 570. His coming out as the prophet is not going to be until he's 40 years old. He lives to the year 632, so 62 years. The sources on his life are a combination of oral, the hadith, narratives of his teachings. There are battle narratives. There are biographical narratives, stories of his life. Some of them are written down fairly early. The combination is thought by modern scholars to be fairly accurate, a fairly accurate depiction, and not much of it is apocryphal. So, on the family trait, he's born in Mecca, within the Quraysh. He's a Hashemite. So here's Hashim, Abd al-Muttalib, and then a couple generations later, and here is Muhammad himself. So he's born into the Banu Hashim. According to an early biographer by the name of Ibn Ishaq, who's of a century later, he's influenced by a so-called Hanif, who is a monotheist, not a Christian or Jew. I'm not so sure we know what the hell he was, but he has been a major influence in teaching Muhammad, and maybe it's a kind of syncretic theology of his own that uses bits of Christianity or bits of Judaism. But having been influenced by this Hanif, Muhammad, inflamed by the idea that there is a higher truth, becomes a seeker, which becomes sort of dramatically evident if you ever read any sections of his book, the Quran. The first revelation is delivered by the angel Gabriel, allegedly, in the year 610. The revelations, which are the basis of the Quran, emphasize God's judgment, human resurrection, ethical duties, piety, and good works. So pretty much you get the bases that have been created within Judeo-Christianity all ticked off here as well. His early attempts at preaching are rejected and attacked in Mecca. They were not having much of it, but he finds converts and defenders in Medina, where he goes on his famous hijrah, or hajira, as some spell it, which is the migration of in 622, at the age of 52, of Muhammad and his fellow Meccans, the ones who decided to follow him. This becomes sort of the moment of the full expression of Islam. This is where the community gets invented in the lore of the tradition. So one community, an ummah, a community of all the clans, is established, and they agree to bring all disputes before Muhammad. So he says, you are now, your piety, your reverence, your homage now is not to a tribe. We've moved beyond tribalism. It is now to a community of true believers. So you cross clan lines and you cross tribal lines, and we are the new Ummah. Now, in the family tree, if you notice, I've highlighted some, I put red boxes in 3 places, and I do this because they will explain the eventual evolution of the caliphates and of the claims to inheriting the mantle and the religious authority of Muhammad. So we're going to see through Al-Abbas, the line who was an uncle of Muhammad's, the line that will establish the Abbasid caliphs that take the caliphate as theirs beginning in 750. Before that, though, and not as close a lineage claim, are the Banu Umayyad, the Umayyads, who will become the caliphs beginning in 662, after the friends and companions of Muhammad, the first 4 caliphs who we'll be talking about, after that line dies down. So claims to connection and claims to authority will proceed within those 2 routes. And then, very significant for Islamic history, through Muhammad's daughter and son-in-law, who is also his cousin. So a first cousin who becomes the son-in-law because he marries Fatima, and they give birth to Hussein. The Shia imams and the Fatimid caliphs of Egypt, and ultimately all Shia of the modern world will claim descent through this line of authority, and we'll see what distinctions are made as we move along through those distinctions. So Islam dominates Arabia by the period 2 years after Muhammad's death. Muhammad and his following from Medina win and lose against the Meccans, but finally negotiate a peace. There were battles that they won, there were battles that they lost. They finally come to terms. The Meccans agree in 625 to convert, and the Kaaba becomes a central shrine. In 625 to 632, there's military success and the consolidation of the Hejaz. So if you see this darker green on the left of Arabia, that's the region that under the leadership of Muhammad, the early Muslims control the western side of Arabia and a bit on the Persian Gulf side over there. Abu Bakr, a companion and father-in-law, becomes the first caliph after Muhammad has died, and he continues the expansion through the rest of Arabia. So in the final 7 years of Muhammad's life, military success comes at the same time. Now, if you could overlap with the end of last week's lecture, it's at the same time, they're having this success at the same time that Heraclius and Khosrow, the heads of Byzantium and the Persian Empire, have bludgeoned each other into exhaustion with the ultimate victory of Heraclius. And it's just right at the edge. 628, 629 is when their war finally ends. Both empires have been taxed into utter exhaustion. And here you have a new player on the scene feeling its oats and beginning to look northwards. At the same time, the completion of the revelations, the surahs, the chapters of the Quran, the organizing elements of the Quran are called surahs, are being completed. And after initially, and this we'll talk about more, after initially seeing his mission as a continuation and purification of earlier religions of the book, Christianity and Judaism, Muhammad finally begins to regard his new brainchild as separate, superior to, separate, a new confession, a new religion, if you will, by the end. And I show this from a Persian manuscript of the next period, and it shows Muhammad leading, although he thinks it's a new religion, he believes it's been a fulfillment of other senior religions of the book. So Abraham, Moses, and Jesus, all of whom are prophets, are being led in prayer by the newest fulfillment of the higher prophecy, who is Muhammad. And so they all are, this is their version of halos, the sacred fire surrounding them. They're all hallowed figures. I don't even know who everybody else in the picture allegedly is. I couldn't find that out. I went digging, but they may have been, we may have a Buddha figure in here for all I know. Anyhow, the Quran. Let us talk about that for a moment. First of all, I just want to show you, this is an early manuscript depiction of the angel Gabriel, who is the angel that announces many things in the tradition, announces to Mary. Here is the angel announcing to Muhammad. Let me get back. The Quran, which means the recitation, also referred to as the discernment, the mother book, the guide, the wisdom, the remembrance, the revelation. It's 140 chapters, surahs. It's regarded as a series of messages revealed to the final prophet. In Sunni Islam, he is the final prophet. The Shia will have a slightly different take on this, as we'll talk about. Revealed to the final prophet via the angel Gabriel. It's accepted as the literal word of God. It's regarded as a culmination of earlier divine messages, the Torah and their spelling, the Zabur, the Psalms, Injil, the Gospels. All of these are sacred revelations and regarded as such within Islam. Now, Muhammad did not write these down. He was not literate in that sense. He may have been a reader, that the book is out on that, but he was not a writer. Remember, lots of stuff in the ancient world was communicated orally. The Quran was partly memorized and partly written down by his companions. A final written version appears after Muhammad's death, and by 700, so 60 years later or so, it's in something approximating a standardized version, which is considered by scholarship today to be valid and as a unified transmission, much the way that the Gospels were not. The earliest of the Christian Gospels, Mark, was maybe not in the form that we receive it in until maybe 90 AD. And since Christ dies in the maybe approximately 27 AD. I know Christ dies at 33, and you think that's going to be 33 AD, but because of the change in calendar, he was probably born in 6 BC and probably died in 27. So the Gospel of Mark probably doesn't reach a final form until maybe 80 or 90 AD. So it's the same kind of gap. The Quran is intended as an ethical guide and is commonly memorized. A hafiz has memorized, as a person who's memorized the entire text, and this is considered a great achievement and great honor, much like a Torah scholar memorizing whole books. I had some lectures when I was a young graduate student from the classicist up at Columbia, Moses Hadas, who was Jewish and knew quite a bit about the Hasidic tradition and the Talmudic tradition. And he said that one of the tests that a Talmudic scholar would be given is that the teacher would take out the standardized book version of one of the texts and take a pin and put it through a word on the first page, and then ask him what words it passes through on subsequent pages, which I always thought must have been one hell of an exam to get through. But there you go. So the Hafiz is somebody who would have memorized the entire text. The hadiths are traditions that get written down later on that describe the prophet's words and actions. So they're not actually the dictated Quran. They're not actually part of the Quran. They're text that says, this is what he said, this is what he did after the fact. And then there is tafsir, textual exegesis, that's used to extrapolate meaning. So very Talmudic in style, if you will. Sharia is rooted in interpretations of the Quran, Sharia law. So the law is derived out of the Quran, but out of the interpretations of the Quran. The great themes of the Quran are monotheism. There is one God, and Muhammad is his prophet. The ethical standards that are addressed time and time again, and what I call here eschatology, a theology of judgment and the afterlife. You will be judged for what you will survive death, and you will be judged for what you do. This manuscript representation I have here is a surah the Al-Alaq. It's the first revelation, and the translation of its beginning, the opening of it, is the following: in the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful. All the praises and thanks be to Allah, the Lord of the world, the most gracious, the most merciful, master of the day of judgment. You alone we worship. You alone we ask for help. Guide us to the straight way, the way of those on whom you have bestowed your grace, not of those who earned your anger, nor of those who went astray. So the concepts of rightness, of wrongness, of being correct, of being creedally sound, are all there. So it resonates in the way that Christianity and Judaism resonate. So Muhammad had serious amounts of contact with Jews and with Christians, because in the beginning, he understands that they are people who've got a superior take on truth than do what he calls the pagan polytheists. And they have tremendously rich traditions and ethical standards. So the presence of Jews in the region dates to the Babylonian captivity. And since antiquity, there were both urbanized and nomadic Jewish populations in Arabia. 3 major Jewish tribes joined the Charter of Medina under Muhammad's leadership, which meant they accepted him as a political leader. And it was still open on whether or not they would see him as the newest prophet in their tradition. In the end, they do not, and they do not convert. And so they do get rejected. But it was an open book in the beginning. So you can imagine that there was a lot of discourse between Muhammad and Jews talking about the tradition of prophecy and the revelation, and where he fit in the sequence. The Christian presence in the region can be dated to the 1st century AD and included Ethiopian Christians from Aksum, that's down over here, who made it over, Nestorians from Syria, and Arians, who now, after the 380s, are heretics in Byzantium. They're a sect that isn't even remotely tolerated. So just like the Ostrogoths in Italy, and so they skedaddle while the getting's good, and a number of them make their way. I would point out that, and I mentioned it somewhere, I think on this slide, that the Christian Arians and Nestorians, particularly, they are sects, Christian sects, that in the debate over the Trinity and the nature of Christ stress Christ's humanity. And so would be much more palatable, since they're not especially the Arians, the claims for Christ's divinity would be muted, and that would be much more acceptable to Muhammad and his converts, and they would find Muhammad more acceptable. So in the Medina period, Najran in the south sent a delegation of Christian priests and scholars to meet Muhammad to debate his role as a prophet. They established a political agreement that granted them rights and protections. Ultimately, they will not accept him theologically, but in the early period, there is commerce, intellectual commerce between them. So, and the reason I go through this background is because of the heavy amount of shared characteristics between Islam and the other two religions. So there is this tradition of prophecy. Muhammad regards himself as following Jesus in the chain of prophecy. And revelation that was begun in the Abrahamic tradition. Not that the Christian traditions, that's what I just said, in Arabia were from groups that emphasized the humanity of Christ. The idea of eschatology, the ideas of resurrection, which, by the way, and afterlife, which, by the way, by this time, were heavily vested in the Jewish tradition as well. While it may not have been in the time of the Torah, certainly in the several centuries that passed by, religious thinking had become fairly sophisticated on the idea that there was going to be and could have been a survival of death. And there were many Jewish traditions that bought into that. And clearly, the Christianity is based on the idea of the anastasis, that's the Greeks call it, the resurrection. And so did Muhammad. The forms of prayer were heavily influenced by Syrian monasticism, actually. The idea that there would be a recitation, a prostration on the ground, and then hand raising. If you've ever watched Muslim prayer on prayer rugs, that was very similar to what Syrian monks in the ancient world would have done in their practice. And then historians were Syrians. Fasting and the whole tradition of Ramadan, atonement and monastic practice from both the Jewish and the Christian monastic practices are a reflection. And I would have I don't know what I pointed out at the time, when I was talking about the hermit tradition and the holy man tradition of the Near East in Egypt and Syria. Monasticism, especially in its more severe forms, as a practice of fasting and asceticism, is a discipline that does not grow up in worlds that are themselves ascetic. It's always, the idea of going to the desert is always a contrast to urban wealth and indulgence. All of these traditions of atonement tend to evolve in societies that have these nexuses of wealth and indulgence, so they can tell stories about Sodom and Gomorrah, so they can tell stories about the flesh pots of Egypt, and the need to go to the desert for 40 days and 40 nights, for 40 years, which I will point out, it was the period of isolation for pandemics. You go into isolation for 40 days, quaranta, you are quarantined, as the Italians would have it. The banning of icons and representational depiction is consistent with Jewish practice, not with Christian practice at the time, but heavily identified with Jewish practice. And since paganism liked to use crude physical representations, and since the world of Arabia still had a lot of animist religious around it, you can see why Muhammad chooses the practice of denying religions of the golden calf, their icons, their representations. So Muhammad dies. what do? We of the new following. We choose amongst ourselves the group, the successors, the Rashidun, the rightly guided caliphs. They were sort of universally accepted because they were from his group, his comitatus, using the term from the Germans. The first four caliphs were from the group of the companions of the prophet. They represent the same coalition of town-centered and nomadic warrior tribes organized by Muhammad. They're initially propelled by intertribal warfare, but now they storm into the vacuum created by the Byzantine and Persian wars. The Persian Empire collapses almost immediately, while a very weakened Byzantium struggles to hold on to its mainland. And so first in 632 to 634, the father-in-law, I should say, and senior companion, Abu Bakr, keeps everyone together. The second Caliph, Umar ibn al-Khattab, is this brilliant general who manages in 10 years, look at this map, to conquer Persia, Jerusalem, Damascus, and Egypt. And so out of Arabia they come. All of Persia, you realize taking the Iranian plateau means taking Afghanistan as well, and making up your way almost to the borders of India, which they soon would be at, into the Caucasus and Armenia, and to the Mediterranean and northern Egypt. Within 30 years of his death, everything that is in these two colors, I don't even know what to call them, sort of the orangey color and the darker reddish orangey, and then that orange, all of this is land all the way to Tripoli in Libya, is taken within 30 years of the death of Muhammad. Now, Uthman ibn Affan, the caliph from 644 to 656, is significantly from the Umayyad clan, and they're going to use him to make the Umayyads to make claims to their authority when the companions of the prophet die out. This is something roughly tantamount to the apostles in Christianity dying out. Early on, Christianity had no problem deciding who its leaders were. It's like, well, you had the guys that walked around with Jesus, and then they all died. And it took a while for the youngest of them, John, who may have been, the legend has him living to 100, and he may have been only about 20 when Christ died. But soon they are all gone, and setting up for the transfer of authority becomes an issue in Christianity, as it does in Islam. So he organizes the standardization of the Quran. As the new empire encounters many languages, you need a standardized version. You realize, by the way, Bedouins and these Bedouin armies, and that's something I'm going to talk about in a slide or two, are significantly outnumbered by the people into whose territories they're moving. And so conquering and setting up a healthy, if you will, sustainable authoritarian bureaucracy is going to be a challenge. So political resistance to Uthman begins to develop. There are claims that he's an authoritarian, that he's appointing relatives, and he's eventually assassinated. And his death produced questions about Islamic governance and the qualifications for leadership. So, I didn't mean to do that. Where am I on that slide? His cousin becomes Caliph, Ali. This is the Ali of Shia claim. Has married Fatima, so he's doubly linked closely. In fact, he's triply linked, as we will see, to the heritage of Muhammad. And he very reluctantly gets appointed caliph. He wasn't somebody looking for it. And he moves the center to Persia, okay? Away from the Mediterranean, where the early caliphs were beginning to gravitate towards. And he moves it to Persia, where it will become a framework for different parties on the eastern and western sides of the Islamic world to contend for dominance. In fact, the first civil war is going to be begun by Muawiyah, who is a cousin of Uthman, who's going to claim that Ali was the murderer of Uthman. And you're going to get literally a civil war. And after many battles and arbitrations, there's a permanent division of Islam. And later on, Ali himself is going to get assassinated. So the first of the great divisions and the question of legitimacy is going to be raised. Now, the claims on Ali's side that there had been an investiture, in fact, up here you'll see a manuscript of Muhammad in the garden at Ghadir Qum, choosing his cousin as his successor, so it's claimed. So in 632, Muhammad delivers a sermon that included the statement, anyone who has me as his mullah has Ali as his mullah. This Arabic term is interpreted by Sunni Muslims to mean friend or one who is loyal and close, and is interpreted by Shiites as master or ruler. I guess there were connotations in both directions, and the two sides decide to take the term differently. After Muhammad's death, the leaders of Medina met with the companions and elected Abu Bakr. That was in 632. Ali, Muhammad's closest relative and favorite, and Fatima refused to pledge allegiance to the first one. So the Shia are claiming, Ali should have been the first caliph right from the beginning. And we have a statement from Ali. I am the servant of God and the brother of the messenger of God. I am thus more worthy of this office than you. I shall not give allegiance to you, Abu Bakr and Umar, when it is more proper for you to give it to me. You have seized this. You and your gang got together and elected you, using your tribal relationship to the prophet as an argument. But I am closer than that. I've got higher claims. And so the argument will begin. The Sunnis, the so-called Orthodox position, is that Muhammad did not appoint his successor before his death, that Muhammad was the final prophet, no more prophecy, it ends there, that leadership and authority are conferred by the Ummah, the community grants it, and its style is going to be rabbinic and Talmudic. Now, to the degree that there is within Sunni Islam no grand central authority, there is no grand rabbi, there are several, there is no pope. Not only is it rabbinic and Talmudic in style, but in organization, it's almost Protestant. You have all these little sects that can pop up and as the local community and give their local adherence to this fellow or that fellow. The Shia, on the other hand, want to make the claim that Ali was appointed imam or leader, that the imams are thought to have special spiritual authority and divinely ordained traits. They're different. It's a kind of a priesthood or an episcopacy. A further line of prophets continued through the family of the prophet, down through Ali and Fatima to Hussein, the hidden prophet. And it's a messianic belief in continued revelation. And so there are these holy representatives that are revered. You see it going on in Iran, where they'll be carrying around images of holy sainted figures, and they'll go to the tombs for intercession, to have these sacred figures intercede for them. So it's very Catholic in style, Shiism. Anyway, I put this little box down here because I could find no other place to mention it in the lecture. The so-called 5 pillars of Islam that define the responsibilities of the Muslim are, first and foremost, you have to have faith, you have shahada, that you pray 5 times a day, the salat, that you give alms, zakat. It's a kind of a tax on all Muslims, that there is fasting, ultimately in Ramadan, the Psalm, and that if you get the opportunity, you do a Hajj, that you make a pilgrimage to the sacred place. The early Islamic occupations, so the armies we see are on the move here. There's negligible resistance in the very early expansion. We've talked about the empires being exhausted, and so they left this fertile ground. They highly taxed their provincial populations to fund their wars, and because of the movement for orthodoxy in Constantinople, Christians in Egypt, Syria, and Mesopotamia, what is now Iraq, were not particularly loyal for sectarian reasons. What do we owe Constantinople? And so they either welcomed or came close to welcoming, in some cases, the new leadership that moved into the region. Now, as far as social and economic relations go, the Bedouin military caste, as I pointed out, was completely outnumbered by local populations. So they were segregated in garrisons to prevent raiding or the destruction of the local economies. The people heading these armies understood we're not here to sack them. We're here to take advantage of their success as economic entities. And so sometimes these garrisons were, as I point out down here, were new cities, or sometimes they're in the suburbs of places like Damascus. So let us keep them from taking advantage of locals. Landed property permanently belonged to the community whose hands it had been in. So there was continued ownership of property. So the new Muslim hegemony didn't take the property away. Soldiers were paid out of taxes on peasants, and these taxes could be very heavy. But revenues from the land could be taken and given to the conquerors. So there was, in effect, a heavy tax on the locals, but their property rights were not abrogated. So there was this period, this very fluid period of mutual toleration. The dhimmi, the Arabic phrase for protected people, peoples of the book, non-Muslims. Their life, their property, and freedom of religion was granted by Sharia in exchange for loyalty to the state and payment of a tribute tax, the jizya, which could be heavy. Muslims, of course, had their own, the zakat, the obligatory alms. Religious communities could even, in many cases, have their own courts. So you had rabbinic courts judging Jews. Political, religious, and financial autonomy of a sort in exchange for political support. Here I show an icon. It's Mary, an Assyrian mosaic, and the text she's holding is in Arabic. The next issue for integration is going to be language, intermarriage, and bureaucracy, because societies cannot stay segregated between the two classes of overlord and the local aristos for very long, as we will see. So, from 661 to 750, the Umayyad Caliphate. The Banu Umayyah, they're a prominent Meccan clan of the Quraysh. They opposed Muhammad, but shortly before his death embraced Islam when it became in their interest to do so. A member of the class, that was Uthman, the guy we talked about, was the third Rashidun Caliph. His assassination led to the legitimacy battle with Ali. Muawiya, the governor of Syria, was recognized as caliph in Syria and Egypt. After the assassination of Ali, he forced Ali's son Hussein to abdicate. So in 676, Muawiya nominates his own son as the next caliph, and a hereditary rule begins to develop within the caliphate and will become a source of contention ever after. Was it ever meant to be that? The Umayyads based themselves, because Muawiyah was based as the governor of Syria in Damascus, they are based in Syria. And their military expeditions expand into, if we look at the map a little more closely, into Central Asia, into Samarkand, all the way through to the border of India and across the Maghreb of Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco, all the way into Spain, all the way into France, where in 732, in a famous battle, their armies are stopped by the army of the Franks being led by Charles Martel, who was Charlemagne's grandfather. Charlemagne, who we'll talk about in the next session. And so they back up to the other side of the Pyrenees and accept control of Al-Andalus, Spain, which they have taken from the Visigoths and Spain.
Hi, when did you?
Hello.
Okay, Carol, why is Tim Stannis in Woodbridge?
You have to mute. We can hear you.
He's asking a question, I think. What's your question? Or no? No? Sorry. Or you could write the question in chat. Anyhow, in the Visigoths in this period are completely overwhelmed and leave the map of history. We never hear, I mean, they are there, but no more is there any kind of Visigothic hegemony in Spain. If I blow the map up a little bit, you'll see that there will remain some Christian control in the north, and what we think of as the Côte Basque, and there were Christian mountain dynasties that never surrender to the armies of the Umayyads and will eventually push Christian control, but it'll take 700 years of battles in Spain for the Reconquista to succeed and for Spain to have become a Christian place. Again, what we see in the Umayyad domination is an empire that has been politically spread but decentralized. There will be sectarian revolts, civil wars. And while we're ahead of ourselves in talking about it at this point, from the 8th century, Islam is a culture and a religion, but is never a political entity, a single political entity. All of this is not a single political thing. You're going to find very soon after this period, local controlling groups setting up Berber elements, Fatimids in Egypt, different groups in the Asian plateaus. And Islam, just as Europe is not a unified place, neither will the Muslim universe ever again be a unified place. Now, wars ensue between the Arabs and the Byzantines, and it puts Byzantium on the defensive. The Arabs have taken Syria, Egypt, North Africa. They make continuous attacks on what we would call Turkey, Anatolia. The Umayyads wanted to capture Constantinople because they knew if they could do that, they could get the capital to fall, the rest of the provinces would fall to them very easily. There are 2 sieges that take place of Constantinople, one between 674 and 678, and the other one between 717 and 718. They used naval bases along the coast of Asia Minor to blockade, because they control Syria and Palestine, so they can launch a navy, and Egypt, to blockade the city from the seaside. Constantinople is land exposed and sea exposed. But the Greeks destroy the Arab navy using so-called Greek fire. They had developed, this is from a manuscript of John Skilitzes from, I believe, the 11th century. It was some kind of thing like napalm. Nobody's sure what it was, but they were able to project incendiary fire at a distance. So they could arm their ships and burn the Muslim Navy ships with impunity. And it was a weapon that stood them in good stead and was used for the next century and a half. It was a real technological breakthrough. We know very little about who developed it. So the period of peace that followed this in the 686-90s allowed Constantinople to regroup, and they managed what was always going to be a threat from on their northern border from Slavs and Bulgars, who we'll be talking a lot about at some point along the way. The second attempt was when there was by the Muslims to siege Constantinople, was when there had been a breakout of near civil war within Byzantium, and they sent a gigantic army and fleet again, and again, it couldn't breach the walls. The Arab force really suffered from the stretched supply lines. Greek fire again took its toll on the Navy. And since now they're recruiting the Navy from Christian elements in Egypt, who had always been sailors, you get a lot of Christians defecting to the Greek side. So the consequences, the Umayyad dynasty becomes weakened, and Byzantium stands as a block to Muslim ambitions over the next 7 centuries. So within the Umayyad Caliphate, they had to make the transformation from simply being a Bedouin elite. What begins as a segregated military caste eventually becomes wealthy landed gentry. Once nomadic merchants and pastoralists, they're now sedentary squires. It took a while for this to happen, but it happens over a century. Wealth disparity in the new cities, class begins to displace tribe as the organizing groupings. You get the internationalization of armies. So they're now recruiting, the Arab armies are not Bedouins anymore. They're Persians, they're Turks, they're Ethiopians, they're Berbers, they're Sudanese, they're Slavs, they're Indians in some cases. The empire's polyglot. In many places, the local languages dominate daily business. There's an immense urban growth that takes place in the new cities as new classes are being attracted from the Arab world into them. Nestorian Christians and Jews assume significant and political mercantile positions in a lot of the new cities because they had these in their background tradition and were able to move into the cities in the Near East and in North Africa, places like Alexandria. They came from mercantile traditions and knew how to build businesses and generate more wealth in those regions. Intermarriages are now at this point not uncommon. You will soon get caliphs who have Persian mothers. And we'll talk about that in a bit. Religious conversion now has financial and political advantages. Well, I can get out underneath my tax burden if I decide, if I'm a successful Christian merchant in a place like Alexandria or Damascus, and it may be worth my while to convert. I can get better political connectivity. Religion's now not defined by ethnicity anymore. So the fact that I have an historian background isn't going to work against me. I'm part of the Ummah. The new empire has success, it has wealth, it has power. It's attracted to people. So this becomes the period of voluntary conversions. There's never really a period of forced conversion. I have a picture here of the great mosque of Damascus, which was formerly the Basilica of John the Baptist. And I picked this of the early mosques to show, since it is the great sort of achievement, success mosque of the Umayyads and their capital at Damascus. There were many mosques in this period that were worthy of taking a peek at. And this is true to the case throughout the former Christian and Jewish regions, was repurposed. It was originally a temple of Hadad in the Aramaean era. Then it became the temple of Jupiter in the Roman era. And then it became a basilica of John the Baptist. And they have a shrine to the head of John the Baptist. They have a Christian relic in the mosque. The theme is martyrdom. It's in the shrine where allegedly the head of Hussein ibn Ali, the son of Ali, the Imam himself. It's the shrine of the head of John the Baptist, and it's where Jesus will return at the end of time. So if we looked a little more closely, I've never had an opportunity to see it. It looks pretty special. So if we look at the Umayyad Caliphate in the year 750, the early conquered periods in the darker green, the lighter periods in the lighter green, or the later conquests, the Byzantine Empire, there's sort of a no man's land around Armenia, but pretty much the Umayyads have controlled for Islam the majority of Africa and Asia as from a European point of view. The Byzantine Empire still has footholds in the toe and heel of Italy. It still has some control in Rome and Naples. It runs up the Dalmatian coast of Croatia. They are always being pressured by Bulgars, Slavs, Avars, Hungarians, the Magyars, which are also being resisted by the Franks in the north, and we have the Lombards controlling Italy. And sort of this is what the world looks like in 750. The Abbasids in 750 take over. They're descended from a Hashemite uncle of the prophet. They've got closer blood ties than do the Banu Umayyah to the prophet. They were based initially in Khorasan, which is over here in the eastern Persian part, the Iranian plateau part of the empire. They defeat the Umayyads with extensive help from indigenous Persians. And so their caliphate, which is going to last 5 centuries, sort of, as I'll describe when we get there, is going to be heavily Persianized. Al-Mansur, the second Abbasid caliph, integrates his court with Persians and other non-Arabs. And it's going to, in effect, secularize the Islamic court, because many of the elements are going to be non-Arabs. They're going to be Jews, Christians, leftover Zoroastrians. The caliphate bases itself in Kufa, okay? And then builds its new capital nearby in Baghdad. So Baghdad is a created city, as Cairo will be later on, is a created city and is going to become the head of Islam, at least either the actual head or the nominal head of Islam for the next foreseeable centuries. The Umayyad Caliph, at the time of the loss to the Abbasids, Abd al-Rahman I, goes off on a several-year toot across North Africa, and he is the one who then enters Spain. Spain had been dominated by their early conquests in the 720s and 730s, but in 750 he comes back to Spain and establishes an independent emirate at Cordoba. So at this point, if we look at this map a little more closely, instead of beginning to see a unified world, we tend to see the Umayyad Emirate here, Idrisids of Morocco controlling the Maghrib up here, the Aghlabids, another clan-oriented group that take Sicily and become an emirate of their own, allegedly, and the Tahrids. Now, a couple of these groups, the Tahrids and the Aghlabids, acknowledge the suzerainty of Baghdad, but they're really like dukedoms, duchies, reporting to the big guy. They're really not directly controlled. They control their own purse strings and the like. The Idrisids are fairly independent. And of course, these were the enemy originally. And they will try to claim that they are still caliphs, even though they eventually accept simple emir status. So it's a politically fragmented, multicultural universe that we find ourselves in at this point. And it's from this period, at the point that Cordoba's been established, the Abbasids have taken power and built Baghdad. It's from this period on that we enter what people like to call the golden age of Islam. From the late 700s, or around 800 AD, for the next several centuries. And we're going to look at that formally. We're going to look at the golden ages of Baghdad and Constantinople, Byzantium, in the 6th lecture, coming up in a couple of weeks. But this is the view of the world as we now have it. The West has sort of been cut out of a lot of contact with the Mediterranean. They've got threats from this period going forward, from Viking raids. They can't build a concentrated imperial defensive system, even though Charles will try, Charles and the Carolingians. You have the Arab presence making itself felt in Spain, in Sicily, Lombards in Italy are going to be threats pretty soon, no more, after Charles finishes with them. You're going to get the beginnings of Italian cities beginning to carry on their own trade in the Mediterranean. Like, you'll notice on this map, of all places, Amalfi is mentioned because it was a major player come the year 800 as a trading city. The tiny Amalfi on the Amalfi Coast, which is now a tourist town of about 5,000 people, if it is that, was a shipping center in that period. And Constantinople as a hub controlling what remains of the Byzantine Empire, and we'll see what happens to it as we continue. And that is it for today. I will unpin me. Let's remove the pin. Are there questions? This was we're covering a lot of ground on this one. And hopefully the next couple sessions we'll begin to tie it together, because essentially calling this class the early Middle Ages is an attempt to talk about the rise to power that Europe experiences. But the background to that is very involved and very slow in coming. And we will only begin to see the roots of it happening as this course ends. And we'll really see the development of it in the next course, which will also be a succession class called the High Middle Ages. Anyhow.
Lou?
Lou,
Laurie, go ahead.
So I'm missing the main motivation for the Islamic expansion. Was it a land grab, resources? It doesn't seem like it was religion because there wasn't forced conversion.
It was, let's say it was a combination. Let's say it was an attempt to bring the true faith and superior civilization and enlightenment. But I would say it was really opportunism. Remember, the first place they hit is Persia because it was there to be had. And they envied it. This was where the two empires were where civilization was. In fact, what I want to point out is when at the point of the Arab expansion, even more dramatically than Germans coming into the Roman Empire in the West. Remember when I called it a gold rush? And I was saying there were tribes like the Ostrogoths who were great admirers of Romanitas. Well, these Arabs, Bedouins, were great admirers of civilization and indeed did not destroy the cultures of any of the places that they then establish overlordship over. They come and and in fact, at one point when I talk about the Persianization of the Abbasids in the final lecture, I tell when we look at the various art forms that are fostered in the period, one of the things I look at is popular literature, and I use the 1001 Nights, the Arabian Nights, Scheherazade and the King, and particularly because you get the sense of how non-religious the popular tradition was and how invested it was in court behavior and with an interest in high culture. And in fact, all the early intellectual work in the Abbasid Golden Age is, for the most part, secular. It's philosophical, it's medical, it's mathematical. It involves itself in every known science and art form that was available. They came as lovers of the civilization. They don't destroy Damascus. They don't destroy Cordoba. They say, look what you have here. Let's make this ours. And they put their stamp on it. They use the churches. Let's not flatten the church and build the mosque. Let's just paint over the pictures of John the Baptist, take down a few crucifixes, and bring our presence into the holy place. You know, it really is both. You called it a land grab. I say it's an attraction. It's a desire to be the lords of civilization in this period.
Hey, Lou, what size were the armies that went west? I mean, I've got no idea about a size.
I don't think they were large. I don't have numbers for you, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. I believe they gathered as they went. First of all, the going west wasn't something that happened in one generation. It starts happening in 670, let's say, and continues all the way into the 730s. So that movement west, they pick up Berber adherents. A lot of people get attracted to the armies, as when the Crusades get announced, a lot of Normans and a lot of freebooting Christian knights get attracted to the armies of Christ headed towards the Holy Land. Hey, there's adventure over here. There's riches to be had. It takes on the trappings of a kind of a Viking raid and picks up force as it moves. My guess is that when they finally have gotten to the Battle of Tours, that maybe we have armies of 10, 15,000, 20,000 facing each other. I'll try to find out more about that. I'm not much of a military historian.
Lou, how pronounced were the Shia-Sunni conflicts in that era, in that period?
It was fairly dramatic at its root cause, but remember they were fairly segregated, the populations, in places. And so it isn't that you would get it. Persia was going to be a problem because you had both elements present, but there were places that Ali's followers had never gotten to until later on. But it was always a tension under the, plus the fact that you have overlords who are secularists and want to keep the lid on. But these were not, you don't really find civil wars erupting over that. Maybe in North Africa you do a bit with the Fatimids later on.
So maybe the conflict is more pronounced today than it was then in that expansion period.
Yeah, and even today, I didn't find the Iranians taking great issue with the Saudis who were taking down the Twin Towers at the time. They seemed, even today, I find it subdued. Only with Saddam Hussein, who made the rift a nationalist rift,
right,
in the 80s, did you find did it look like it was an international war? I tend to think that they had their moments like 16th century Germany and Switzerland of warfare between Protestants and Catholics, but only when the politicians of those regions had a political stake in making a war out of religion. You know, I don't know how pronounced conflict ever is from religious motive itself. It's probably a mix of all these things. Good question. Hard to answer.
Mm-hmm.
Anyhow, you get there's more interesting art and architecture and future lectures. We had to get through a lot of history today. This was map centric.
All right, Luigi.
Okay. See you, troops.